Lukas Ligeti, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm so glad we could do this. We've been trying to put this together for over a year now, I think. And here you are in Kehl.
Great to be here. Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation.
My pleasure. I've got thousands of things I want to ask you about. And this is going to be a really special episode for me because I get asked all the time about improvised music. And it's not something I know a great deal about. It's a tradition that is fascinating to me, but it's very much a parallel tradition. And you're extremely interesting, among other things, because you exist in this kind of crossroads between composed music and improvised music, and these two traditions, and you've managed to weave them together. So I wonder if we could maybe start there. And I have to also start by saying that you've just put out a new disc. We're going to be talking about that today as well, called Notebook, which is also the name of the ensemble you've been working with. And I think it's an incredible disc. We're going to get into, what's the things that are specifically interesting about it. But maybe we could start with a very general question, which is if you could talk a little bit about the interaction between written music and improvisational traditions in your work.
Well, I guess for me, I started with music very late. I think that might come as a surprise to some people who, have a certain imagination of what my childhood may have looked like, but I was never forced to learn music as a child. And I didn't want to really. So I had a couple of piano lessons when I was 9 years old. And I very quickly decided that reading music was impossible. And for some reason, maybe I don't have this gift of being able to read music and convert it into movement that I can put on the piano right away. So I remain not a very good sight reader. And I always felt much more like just sitting down and playing. And I did this on the piano as a kid, but not very much. And then when it came time to figure out what to do professionally after high school, I had to admit to myself that I'm always hearing music in my head and that it would probably be a good idea to do something with it. People were telling me, oh, you're 18 years old. It's too late to be a pianist or a violinist or something like that. You need to play an easier instrument. So in part for that reason, I chose the drums. And I then went to study classical percussion at the Music Academy in Vienna. I grew up in Vienna. And I very quickly saw that my future is not as an orchestral percussionist, not so much because I wasn't interested in the music. I love, the orchestral repertoire. But I wasn't so interested in the social atmosphere of playing in an orchestra. And I also wasn't so interested in the role of percussion in a lot of orchestral music. And then, more contemporary chamber music with percussion can be extremely difficult. And then it turned out that I wasn't that interested in that music, maybe that make the huge effort to learn to play that. And so again, I very quickly resorted to improvisation and saw that for me, there's something very special about making music up on the spot, about making decisions quickly, and that I was much more interested in developing my own personal vocabulary on the instrument and sort of being able to contribute that personal vocabulary in a spontaneous way to musical environments that I was confronted with. And so for me, it wasn't really so much a pursuit of any kind of tradition. I had become very interested in jazz for sure. And then I soon, started listening to quote unquote free improvised music. And I found that very interesting and fascinating to listen to because I felt that I'm listening to musicians thinking out loud, basically. Which is not to say that interpreting musicians who play from a score are not thinking out loud, but it's a different type of decision making, and you're being alert to different aspects of the music, I think. And something that has always fascinated me very much is how do we think? What are our thought processes while playing music? What are we listening to? What's relevant for us, and what's just what's peripheral? And as internally to an ensemble, you might be paying attention to very different things to what the audience is paying attention to. So that disconnect, if you want, was interesting to me. And I think I started doing something that I still do today, which is I started coming up with musical ideas, questions. And then I tried to find responses to these questions. I'm not going to say answers because I rarely find answers. What I find is more questions, but some sort of response to these questions, some sort of way to deal with these questions in different contexts. So I might examine a certain idea in a fully through composed context, and I might examine it in a fully improvised context, and then maybe in context that lie somewhere in between on the spectrum between fully composed and fully improvised. And what that even means, fully composed or fully improvised, that is something that one can talk about. But so for me, it always seemed like the one was a lab for the other. Like I would get ideas while improvising that I could then investigate in compositions, and the other way around. And I would have people who, liked my composing tell me, "Oh, your compositions are good. Why do you waste your time improvising? You should just compose. You would compose more, and that would be better." And exactly the same thing, vice versa, with improvisers telling me, "Oh, composition is something that's, from past ages. Today we improvise." And composers would tell me, "But through improvisation, you can't reach the same level of quality as in composition." And these kinds of arguments, I understand the gist. But for me, it was always extremely interesting to go back and forth between the two. And then it took me quite a long time to be able to try to somehow bring the two together, because for a long time I was completely composing or completely improvising, as much as one can do any one of those completely. And at some point I started finding ways of combining these fundamentally, I guess, very different approaches. And for example, this CD notebook and this group notebook is about that. It's about different ways of combining composition and improvisation. But to me, there is no set way of doing this. I don't have any kind of method that I employ. I always try to approach it in a new way and try to come up with different ways about thinking about music making. I think that's what it's really about for me.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it started with the instrument for you as an embodied experience of music, right? As opposed to something more abstract.
I mean, there's certainly an element of that. And the physical act of playing an instrument is something that is very important to me. Also, when I do electronic music, for example. But at the same time, I would say that maybe my original motivation to improvise was just that I wanted to play music, and I didn't want to have any paper in front of me that I'm reading, because I felt that was difficult to do. And maybe also I felt that it constrained me in my freedom, which is something that I don't think I would feel anymore today. I mean, when I say would, I say that because I'm really not an interpreting musician. I write music, but the music that I play is usually not written down. So reading music is something that happens to me when I'm, reading something on the piano for fun or something like that, but I don't do that in public. Maybe I'll play from a lead sheet in public, but it's mostly with the kind of music I play on the drums. The notation is usually very partial and fairly simple. And so I don't actually have a lot of experience playing as an interpreter of music, but I think that in many ways you're just as free as an interpreter. I mean, you probably, as we're talking, we have the 457th recording of a Beethoven string quartet being made, and there is a reason why the people doing this are doing it. They feel that they have something to add to the world of interpreting that piece. And I think that goes to show, and in many cases they do, and I think that goes to show how much freedom there actually is in playing notated music. The notation only addresses certain aspects of the playing, and there's many aspects that remain unaddressed. So I always find it very strange and superficial when people complain about, how notation stifles the imagination and things like that. But I think that as a very beginner, when I had this kind of, at that point, superficial view of making music, that was a factor. And somehow I never recovered from that in my own personal practice.
Okay. So you said that it's two different types of thinking, two different types of musical intelligence or musical thought. So the performers who play from scores primarily, and then people who are improvising with a more or less detailed structure. But in any case, it's a different, fundamentally different approach. What do you think is the nature of that thought exactly? Because I've encountered many classically trained musicians who, by their own admission, are completely incapable of improvising. Right? So do you think that they could learn to do that, or is it just that their minds don't work in the same way?
I think that, first of all, I think there's a lot more than two different ways of thinking, because there's a lot of music traditions in the world, for example, that require different ways of thinking about musical structure and sound and so many different aspects of music, pitch, whatever. And so these different music traditions will be pre-planned, premeditated, and improvised to different degrees. For example, Africa has a vast number of music traditions, and people who don't have much experience with African music tend to think that there's a lot of improvisation going on. But there are actually African music traditions that have virtually no improvisation at all, and others that have limited improvisation, but very few that could be considered primarily improvised.
I think that misunderstanding comes about because it's not primarily a written tradition. Right?
Exactly.
There's no notation.
Right. I mean, of course, you could say the same about other non-European traditions as well. But can one learn to improvise? It's a very interesting question. I taught for a couple of years in a doctoral program at the University of California, Irvine, called Integrated Composition, Improvisation, and Technology. And when I first started there, I thought, wow, this is the perfect place for me, because that's exactly what I'm interested in. But it turned out that the pedagogy of improvisation was not something that was being discussed much in that program. And I was not successful at instigating such discussions. And I walked away, and after a couple of years, I resigned from there for a number of reasons. I had a number of frustrations with my environment there, and that was one of them, that I didn't really know what we were doing with improvisation in terms of how do you teach improvisation, or how do you deal with questions of learning improvisation at all when you have a pool of people that you're working with from a highly diverse set of backgrounds, with familiarity with different types of improvisation to different degrees. Some people who are deeply into, for example, the study of jazz, and others who've had very little contact with improvised music traditions at all, but are just interested in it for some reason. And I think it's a really, really big question. How do you teach improvisation? I think it's possible to teach it, but I think that a lot of the people who are, let's say, classical musicians and believe that they cannot improvise, I think it's that they've somehow been intimidated, not necessarily by music teachers who intimidated them, but maybe just simply by the environment, and by maybe the idea that there's some kind of perfection that is being achieved in these compositions. Of course, different people have different, let's say, differently productive musical imagination. And it's conceivable that somebody would be fantastic at playing music composed by somebody else, but have very little impetus to create their own music, whether it's written or not. Mm-hmm. That exists. So I don't think it's possible to give a a generalized answer to a question like this. I think it really depends on the individual, just as what kind of musical talent we have depends on the individual. Some people are, my musical talent is very different probably from yours, and so on and so forth.
Well, I remember seeing an interview with Heinz Holliger once, where the interviewer expressed admiration at the fact that he had the capacity to be an internationally renowned soloist on the oboe, and a composer, and a conductor, and a pianist, and all the different things that he does. And Holliger didn't waste a second. He shot back, "That's just a normal musician."
Okay.
And I think that's a slight rhetorical exaggeration. I don't think you have to do all of those things to be a normal musician. But I kind of understand what he's saying, that it's all connected, and it's an embodied experience of music, that it isn't just an intellectual or a written exercise, but it's something that you do with your body. And he's very interested in physicality and pushing the limits of what he can do on his instrument. And I think as an aspiration, absolutely. I mean, it would be wonderful if everyone did all of those things. It's probably not realistic. We all have different skills and different things that we excel at, and so on. But as an ideal, I think it would be wonderful. One of my great regrets is I don't have a performing career. It's not something that it might not be compatible with my temperament, or it's not my strong suit, and so I ended up moving away from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know people who are able to sit down at an instrument and very quickly work their way to a pretty high degree of fluency on the instrument. I'm not one of those people. It takes me a long time. I'm clumsy in the beginning, I think. So I really only play the drum set. I play bad piano for home use. But yeah, I think there's many, many ways to be a good musician. And the way that Holliger suggested is one. But for me, it's less about even being a musician. It's about trying to contribute some new forms of expression, some new ways of thinking to the world, trying to somehow expand our range of ideas. And the fact that I do this through music is maybe rather coincidental. I'm not very talented, I think, at painting. So I think it's a good thing that I'm not a visual artist. But I think there's many ways that I could do it. Somehow it turned out that I picked music. It wasn't the easiest choice, but I think for me, it's the imagination as a composer that counts a lot more than the musicianship side. Mm-hmm. I mean, my musicianship is decent. I did the whole conservatory training, and I was good at it, but there's people who are better at it, and I don't need the most sophisticated musicianship skills on a daily basis as I'm composing. What I need much more is original ideas.
My sense is that improvisation becomes a lot less intimidating as a practice if you focus on listening rather than demonstrating what you can do on the instrument, right? So improvisation doesn't have to be synonymous with extraordinarily off-the-cuff demonstrations of virtuosity.
No, absolutely it doesn't. And in many cases, I think it's better if it doesn't. I think, again, there's, probably as many approaches to improvisation as there are people doing it. There is an improviser in France, Jean-Charles François, a percussionist, who gives workshops on improvisation. And his approach is only react, never act. So it's a very Cagean inspiration in a certain way, because if nobody acts, what are you going to react to? Well, maybe there's some sound in the environment or something happening that basically pulls the trigger for the improvisation to begin, but you're only supposed to react. It's very interesting to play under these kinds of circumstances. It's not my personal approach. I try I tend to be rather proactive and even assertive in improvisation. But I think it's not so much about showing off what I can do on the instrument. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's about, for me, about developing a personal idiosyncratic vocabulary on the instrument and then being able to contribute that to the conversation that is an improvisation. Of course, there's a huge difference between solo improvisation and group improvisation. I do a lot of solo concerts on electronics mostly. Then with groups, I mostly play the drum set. I have done solo drum set concerts. That's a very challenging thing. Some people do it great. I've tried. I don't do it frequently. But I think it's about also in improvisation coming up with music that is stylistically and formally coherent in some way or another. And I just think that how you define this coherence is very different whether you're in a notated or in an improvised realm. And again, along the continuum between those two, if you want to call them extremes, there's also a continuum of how to define those aspects, and then maybe sometimes completely new factors come into play that only come in through the combination of these approaches. I mean, sometimes I'll have a student showing me a piece of music that's partially composed and partially improvised, and there'll be a section that's completely written out, and then another section that's completely written out, and in between there's a section that's not written out at all, and then it's just like improvise your way from section A to section C. The section B is just and my response to that is sometimes something like, well, I mean, you knew exactly what you wanted in section A. You knew exactly what you wanted in section C. Why is it that you don't know what you want in section B? Like, are you actually asking these musicians to improvise, or are you asking them to help you compose?
Right.
Because, maybe it's just because you didn't know what you wanted to do there. So then think about it and come up with it. I think that improvisation should only be done when you have a real inner need to improvise, and composition should only be done when you have a real inner need to compose. And I think whatever the kind of the challenge is that you're facing, it's about choosing the method that you believe will bring you to an interesting result. I mean, it's the same thing just within composition, right? I mean, I've got to sit down now and compose a piece. Am I going to start writing on 5-line music paper? Am I going to start punching things into the computer? Am I going to sit down at the piano and experiment? Like, how am I going to go about this? It depends. I don't have a set method.
Right. Well, that's also a form of improvisation, though. That's something that
Life.
Sure.
Life.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that Feldman talked about a lot. He said that for him, sitting down and composing was a type of performance, in the sense that, it only moves forward. It implies that he doesn't go back and correct things afterwards, and he doesn't make drafts and lots of sketches and so on. He just sits down, and whatever he's able to come up with in the moment goes into the piece. And but you have to be in a certain state, a certain mental condition to be able to do that. But I thought that was a very interesting thing to say. There's also a piece, what you were saying about a piece where you have to suddenly stop and improvise something to get from A to B. There's what I think is quite a witty piece by Brian Ferneyhough called Sieben Sterne for organ. I don't know if you know this piece.
No, I don't know.
So he kind of makes fun of this whole dichotomy by writing a score in which most of it is fully notated in his characteristic, extremely complex notation with multiple rhythmic staves going on simultaneously. And then there are passages that are written using very vague instructions or simple sort of pictographs. And the instruction is, improvise this section, but try to make it sound as close as possible to the notated bits. Which I love.
Well, I mean, with a lot of contemporary music, the scores are exceptionally complex. And I often ask the question, wouldn't one be able to come up with a very similar result much more easily through improvisation?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's definitely true. And I think Ferneyhough has a sense of humor. I don't know him personally, but I think that it shines through also his very complexly notated music that, I mean, we all know that this is not doable. In a sense, it's graphic art, but in a sense, it's also an instigation to improvise in a certain way, or to approximate,
Well, or
and to fail, maybe.
Yeah, or to fail, or to break out of habits also, and to suggest a different relationship between notation and performance.
Right. Which is something that I try to do too, except that my method or my means of doing it is completely different from Fernihoe. I could never write scores like that. Yeah. And I think that my scores are generally relatively simple, even if the music is sometimes very complex and sometimes exceptionally difficult to play. But that doesn't have to reflect necessarily in complex looking scores. But I also really try to notate as simply as possible, because to me, notation is a code of instructions to musicians of what to do. And the most economical way that I can convey my thoughts to the musicians seems to me to be the most preferable. So that's also why I sometimes don't even write something out, because sometimes it's not necessary. And of course, in the new music world, we are not in a situation where we have something like figured bass, a tradition, a language where everyone basically knows, okay, you have to play the third. I don't have to write three there. And we don't, in our current, environment of contemporary music, we don't have something like that. Nothing can be taken for granted. But depending on who I'm working with, maybe some things can be taken for granted. And in a group like Notebook, for example, we take some time to develop, let's say, certain conventions of interplay where I can then talk or mention something only very briefly, either orally or in written form, and it will be understood by my colleague.
Well, the thing I'm trying to understand about Notebook is on every track, there's some form of polyrhythm at play. The rhythms are, the individual rhythmic strands might not be complex in and of themselves, but the way they lock together and create larger patterns is very complex. And it's totally absorbing. It's extremely exciting to listen to. I've never heard that. I mean, this is probably my limited exposure to improvised music, but I haven't heard such extraordinary precision in the performance combined with polyrhythm in an improvisational setting like that before. And so maybe this connects back with your, you're an expert on African percussion music, and maybe it connects to that in a way that you could elaborate on. But I'm interested in knowing more about this.
Yeah, I think it has a lot more to do with the African background than with the improvisation background, to be honest. Because a lot of improvised music that you hear is either based on grooves in more of a jazz or, rock sense, or, some whatever the groove is, or there's no perceptible meter or groove at all. And there's a lot of free improvisers, for example. I mean, free improvisation also has its cliques, like all types of music, and everything in the world has its social and aesthetic cliques. And there's a lot of, sub units of improvised music, sub scenes of improvised music where playing a groove is frowned upon. And something that I like to do as a free improviser is to say that I'm really free if I'm free improvising. So I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to challenge you by playing a groove, because you never play with a groove. You think that's not something interesting to do. So I want to see how you react to that, because that's going to create a new situation that we're not used to, and it might lead to an interesting result. Some improvisers react very negatively to that form of challenge. And then they don't invite me again. But I like to do that, because I always like to create new ways of thinking and challenge people to go outside of their comfort zones. In Notebook, it's a rehearsed music. So this is not a free improvised music. When I say free improvised, I pretty much imply that there hasn't been any deliberate premeditation, no rehearsals, no real discussion of what we're going to do. I made a record back in the year 1999. It was only released in 2011, because with the kind of music that I make, it's sometimes so unclear what stylistic, genre it belongs to, that it's difficult to find ways to release it. So Notebook also, that record was recorded about 8 years ago. And it took me a long time to find a place to put it out. The CD Pattern Time, which was then ultimately released in 2011 on the label Innova from Minnesota, is almost completely free improvised, but still uses a lot of polymetric layering. And I think that it sounds radically different from any improvised music that I've ever heard elsewhere. But it has a very strong African influence. It's a kind of African jazz that sounds completely different from the African jazz that is known. In Notebook, I think that, there's every piece has a score. The score is usually a mixture of music notation and verbal instructions. And we do a lot of cueing off of each other and different ways of listening to each other so that we're able to keep track of these polymetric layers. Sometimes I basically conduct the ensemble from my drums. Sometimes I actually conduct. I'm not a conductor at all, but there's one piece on that record where I actually stand in front of the ensemble and conduct, which basically means giving cues and showing them dynamics and speed and things like that. I mean, I don't beat a 4/4 or something like that.
But I mean, there are also what sound like completely spontaneous improvisations. So, for example, the saxophone solo in Kaleidoscope Point, I assume would be different from performance to performance.
Right. So that is a section where basically I said, let's play basically a saxophone and drum duet that really channels the energy of, let's say, high energy free jazz. So I kind of use that as a module in my piece. And I think, when I put together improvised music, performances or programs, I think very much in terms of modules. So I invite musicians of whom I think that their personal expression on the instrument will, I think of this like a module that I put into the puzzle. It's like a piece of a puzzle. There will be that aspect of music that comes from this person's very personal sensibility. And then I try to combine, like some people, like I think John Zorn likened it to being a film director. And you're choosing your actors that will bring certain voices, certain ways of expressing themselves in. And I think that's a very apt comparison, actually. And so, for example, the pieces that the people that play a Notebook, I invite them because I know that their personal ways of expressing themselves will bring certain elements that are predictable to me to some degree, because I kind of know that person's world. But it's then also completely within the discretion of that person to surprise me, and that's a rather desirable thing, I would say. And I try in the notated aspects of the music to allow space for that to happen. But for example, I know that Dan Blake, the saxophonist in the group, can play that kind of a solo fantastically. And so I asked him to do that because I thought, okay, at this point, I want a certain type of energy that is best harnessed through that kind of a reference and through that kind of an improvisation. If I'm going to write this out now, it's going to look dreadfully complicated, and the musician will just be sort of, stiff because of all of these notes. So, sometimes things that improvisers play, things that I myself play, I can barely notate some of the things I play myself, and I actually prefer improvised music that can't be notated. So I've never been very interested in transcriptions of improvisation. A lot of jazz musicians study a lot of solo transcriptions.
I've never understood that. Like the Cognition concert of Keith Jarrett, you can get the score for that. I cannot understand why you would want to copy note for note somebody else's improvisation.
I mean, I understand it for pure practice purposes. I, as a drum set player, I tried to learn how to play, let's say, bebop drum set. I'm not the best player because it's not something I do on a daily basis. Of course, if it's also a language and you have to be deeply immersed. But I try to play, for example, I try to sound like Art Blakey. Is one of my favorite drummers, and I have so many favorite drummers. I have so many favorite composers. I can't even start the list. But Art Blakey, I thought, was a drummer whose style is very clear, and he has certain mannerisms that I tried to to imitate. So I would look at transcriptions of solos, and I would try to see what are these particular mannerisms, and it can be more easier to get your handle on that through a transcription. But ultimately, what I'm really interested about in improvisation is those elements that are very difficult to notate because they're extremely complex and so personal. So I actually, when I play drums, I try to actually play in a way that is hard to duplicate through notation and also hard to duplicate through programming. So, it's very, very fashionable today for drummers to try to play like a drum computer. And the ubiquity of drum computers has really raised the bar when it comes to precision of drum set playing incredibly. And I actually deliberately play in such a way that it's not sloppy because there's definitely method to the madness. But for example, when I play a rock groove, I deliberately try to play it in such a way that every time I hit the hi-hat, for example, it's slightly different. I don't want to get that consistency. I want to get something unnotatable because I think that this is what I can offer as a human much more easily in that way than now trying to, make random fluctuations in a drum programming or something. Well, with me, it's not random. That's the thing that with there's nothing random about improvising. I'm making fast decisions, but they're not random decisions. They're based on an entire lifetime of skills acquisition, experiences, and things like that. And in some way that comes through. There's a certain coherence in the way that I fluctuate things, maybe, that couldn't be simulated with a random generator.
Well, something I'd like to dive into a little bit more. The drummer from Kraftwerk, the German band, this is a very interesting story to me. Their whole thing was looking and sounding like robots. But at least in the early records, they did this on instruments. And as the band continued, they became more and more interested in drum machines and things like that, and synthesizers and programming. And the drummer started to feel like his creative contributions. I think his name is Karl Bartos, Bartos.
Yeah,
I think I've got that right. Yeah. And he's got a book that's just come out, and I'm gonna read it soon. But basically, it's like, well, what's my role if we're just programming the drums now? And so that's so interesting. It's like if you're pursuing this kind of machine aesthetic, then what can you bring to that as a human player that would be more compelling than what a machine can do?
Well, one thing that I'm really interested in is the difference between something very regular and something very, shall we say, sloppy. And so I find it fascinating, for example, to try to duplicate what a drum machine is doing, but not exactly. I have it to lean on. I work a lot with click tracks. I work a lot with headphone, like information that's relayed to musicians through headphones. The start of that was a piece I wrote. It was actually my first commission back in the year 1993. And it was premiered by the London Sinfonietta at a festival of like Austrian composers in England.
Remember who was conducting?
Heinz-Karl Gruber.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it was also Nali Gruber who got me that opportunity. He's somebody who supported me quite a bit during my early days. He conducted my first orchestral piece too. And he's a really great performer and also great conductor. And
I know him primarily for his recordings of Kurt Weill and George Antheil.
Yes.
Others. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Ballet Mécanique.
And he's done a lot as a chansonnier. Of course, he wrote this piece called Frankenstein that he's become very famous for. So he's definitely a multifaceted musician in the Holliger sense because he He's a fantastic contrabass player, played in the Vienna Radio Orchestra for many years in the Ensemble die Reihe. So he was kind of the resident new music contrabass player in Vienna for many years. But then in this piece, he didn't have a lot to conduct, because actually what I ended up doing is that I gave each one of the 11 musicians a pair of headphones, and they listened to 11 different click tracks in different tempos, or sometimes in the same tempo but staggered. And I actually think that some of the most interesting moments of that piece are where they're all playing in the same tempo but staggered by a very small time increment. And it's the fastest Klangfarben melody in music history, because the music just goes crazy, jumping around between the musicians, and there's absolutely no way that this could be accomplished with a conductor. So ever since that time, I've greatly expanded this method to also include, for example, situations with improvisers where I give improvisers, let's say, different harmonies or something like that they should play to, that the audience doesn't hear, and that the other improvisers aren't hearing, but that one person hears. Some people like, for example, to have improvisations where different musicians are playing alongside each other, but not really interacting. It's almost like they're in their own separate rooms. I don't actually want the headphones to isolate the musicians. I want them to negotiate between what they're hearing in their headphones and what's going on outside with the other musicians. So it's a constant negotiation process. And then the click track or whatever you're hearing in the headphones, often it's also speech. It can be like a friend that you hang out with, and then you go do something else with somebody else, and then you come back and hang out with that friend again. And so these kinds of things need to be rehearsed. There is a piece on the notebook record called Uncommon Notion, where I actually have the musicians playing with headphones. But in this case, as opposed to Groove Magic, that piece that I composed in 1993, the headphones are, what they're hearing on the headphones are not exactly in sync with each other. So here they're listening to their own phones, cell phones. So they all have, I give them certain sound files that they play from their cell phones, and they start more or less at the same time, but then they'll hear at different points, because there's nothing that centrally coordinates this. So that the devices will go off into slightly different speeds. And so I think that's maybe the extent to which I use randomness in my music. I generally don't have a great interest in aleatoric aspects. But in this one piece, I say, okay, well, I don't really care exactly how these different musicians are apart. The main thing is that they're not really together.
Right.
And in a way, it's an expression of how, being buried in our cell phones and with our headphones on and things like that, isolates us from each other and brings us out of step with each other.
There's a wonderful piece from this Gardinelli Cyclus by Holliger, in which it's a choral piece, and it's a canon. And the way it works is each soprano has to put their finger on their wrist, and the pulse that they have at that moment dictates the tempo of their part. And it's not randomness exactly, but it's a physiological contingency that then completely conditions how the music is sung.
It's biofeedback
It's
improvisation.
biofeedback. Well, there's also the piece Cardiophonie. Do you know that one? Cardiophonie for solo oboe. The oboist.
Holliger also.
Yeah, also.
I don't know Holliger's music that
Oh,
well.
he's a fascinating figure. I'm extremely interested in his music. But he did it. So he did this piece where the oboist has to wear a stethoscope, which is then fed into an amplifier, and so you hear the oboist's heartbeat, which then provides the pulse for the piece. And as the piece progresses, the music gets more and more virtuosic, and then which creates a feedback loop, because the more strenuous and physically demanding the part is, the faster the heart rate is, and the faster he has to play. And it ultimately leads to a total cataclysm where you can't go any farther. And I love things like that. I love that piece.
I sure hope the oboist doesn't end up in the hospital. It's a very interesting idea. I personally, I'd love to hear it. Personally, I tend to be more interested in situations where the musicians sort of control their fate a little more. And so biofeedback is something that I haven't really gotten into because I feel that we have very little agency to control this. And I'm actually really interested in personal agency. And that's also, I think that informs my composing, and it also informs my outlook on, a lot of things from, my own personal daily life to politics and everything. This idea of personal agency and of us really being able to be in control of our, of what we do as much as possible. So,
You sound like a libertarian.
I don't really know what libertarianism is today. I probably have elements. I think my worldview has elements of a lot of different viewpoints and cultures. I've also spent, for example, a lot of time in different regions of Africa, so I've become accultured in a certain way to a lot of African customs of how to organize society. I think there's some very interesting things to think about there, and so I think my own personal way of navigating through life is a hodgepodge of European, Central European, maybe Jewish, but assimilated Jewish intellectual background, American improvising musician, my experiences in Africa. There's just a whole lot of things going in there. So I think I've been happy to have the agency to navigate through all these very diverse environments. So I don't know if that makes me a libertarian.
Well, it makes you one of a kind. I mean, your background is completely unique, and this particular mix of cultures and approaches, I think, is really unique. How did you get interested in African music? How did that come about?
So around the time I was about 21, I just started with music. I was playing percussion drums. I was just starting to study composition. My first 2 years basically of studying in Vienna, I was studying percussion and then really practicing the piano a lot so that I can get admitted into the composition studies. And then I did when I was 20. And not very long thereafter, a couple of things happened. One is that my father and I would show each other music that we were interested in. We'd make mixtapes, cassettes at the time, record cassettes for each other. And he would record me cassettes of African music, the Banda Linda, polyphony, and pygmy music and things like that. So I got very interested in that. I also had a girlfriend at the time who had grown up in Malawi and she was Austrian, but had spent a lot of years there and told me a lot of interesting things. It's, by the way, a country that up until now I have not made it to actually go there. But I've spent a lot of time in Southern Africa, so I can, the cultural environment approximately would seem fairly familiar, I think. But then also, I think the real trigger was that one day I fairly randomly happened into a lecture that the ethnomusicologist Gerhard Kubik was giving on the traditional court music of the Kingdom of Buganda, which is in Uganda. And I sat down and listened to this. And by the time that lecture was finished, a whole new world had opened up for me because this music is conceived compositionally, cognitively, interpretationally in such a unique and different way from anything that I had known before that I thought, wow, this is a whole new way of making music. And I guess my interest was always in trying to come up with new musics. So how do I react to this? Like, what now after hearing this? What can I do as a composer, as a totally beginning composer at the time? But what can I do? And I came up with some answers. And this, in a very strong way, defined my further path until today as a composer and also as an improviser, as a musician in general. And so I composed based on that, and then I looked more into ethnomusicological writings by other people and things like that. And so I had maybe accumulated a small body of work influenced by African music traditions, but not at all sounding like them. When at the end of my studies in Vienna, I was invited by the Goethe Institute, even though I'm not German, but they somehow heard about me and invited me to go to Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, which was a part of Africa that I had not familiarized myself with the music from at all. But then I went there and I had another life-changing experience because the Goethe Institute invited musicians to work with me. And, well, too many musicians came to take part in this workshop. And I went together with, it's interesting that you mentioned Kraftwerk before, because I went together with a musician called Piro Lauter, who is a seminal member of, the German new wave and like first wave of do-it-yourself synthy pop music, and a co-founder of groups like the Deutsch-Amerikanische Freundschaft and the Plan. So that comes from a little bit of a similar scene environment as Kraftwerk, actually. And we went down there and we, to the Ivory Coast, and there were so many people. So we were like, what are we going to, we can't work with that many people. So we decided to present ourselves to them by playing some of our most inaccessible and weird sounding music. And the next day, about 15 people came. And these 15 people were the people who were, had the openness to experiment and to try wild things. And we had this 2-week collaboration that for me ended up being a completely life-changing experience. And at the end, we had an ensemble that then named itself Beta Folie, which means the music of us all, in the Malinke language, which is a language mostly spoken in Guinea, Conakry, but the whole Mande culture is very much present in the Ivory Coast. So it goes, basically from Senegal through Mali, Western Burkina Faso, and the Ivory Coast. It takes in that whole kind of southwestern corner of West Africa. And then I kept going back there and working more with those people. And it really is something that completely changed the course of my composing. And it's interesting, you were telling me that you feel that the music in Notebook is in large parts diatonic. And I think that this is in part because it's not a deliberate thing, but it's because I've been very strongly influenced, especially in my melodic imagination, by Mande music, by like balafon, kora music, and things like that. And that is, by and large, it's a heptatonic. I mean, there's also pentatonic balafon music and pentatonic harp lute music and things like that of many kinds in Africa. But this music that I'm talking about here, the Mande music from, of the Malinke, Bambara, Susu, those groups of people, ethnicities in Guinea and Mali and places like that, is generally a heptatonic music that comes somewhat close to a Western major scale. Not completely, but it's close enough. So
how do they tune their instruments? Is there a particular theory behind it? Is it acoustically based? How does it work?
So there are different tuning systems. And one of the fascinating things about being, out in Africa or in a lot of places outside of Europe, musically, is that you can walk from one village to the next and you'll find different ways of constructing the instruments and different ways of tuning them. In Europe, we've become pretty standardized, which has its advantages and disadvantages, right? And I think, I've always argued that electronic music, in many ways, is very compatible with African music, because in electronic music, if you walk up to somebody else's laptop, you have no idea what's going on there. They've built their own instruments. And even if they're using Ableton Live or something like that, you don't really know what their setup is doing. And it's like going to a new village and you find, let's say, a new type of xylophone that strongly resembles something that you already know, but the way it's constructed and its affordances are somewhat different. And so there are a lot of different ways of tuning, but by and large, in a lot of cases, the instrument builders, in the case of the instruments that are not so easily tuned, or the musicians in the case of instruments that are more easily tuned, will start note by note, often starting from the top, in some areas starting from the bottom, and tune note by note and come up with, something that sounds right to them. And exactly what that is based on is something that I've kind of become a little bit of an amateur ethnomusicologist, and it's something that I'd like to explore. And I think that I'm really interested not so much in the tuning exactly, I mean that also, but more in what are musicians focusing on when they play together? What notes are they listening for? What is what are they basing their intonation on, for example? And I think that can be explored. I think it's been insufficiently explored in many cultures. And that's something, if I ever get around to it, writing new music is more important to me probably at the end of the day, but I'd love to explore that more. And I think there's methods that are untried of doing that. But it was really fascinating for me to work with these musicians, that the Goethe Institute organized for me there. And so, for example, one of the sort of seminal experiences that I had there was that there were two balafon players. So the balafon,
can you describe what the bell?
Yeah, it's a West African xylophone or marimba that exists. Balafon is a kind of a overall name, but in different languages it'll have different names. And so, for example, in the voltaic languages, Dagara and Lobi, that you find more between Ghana and Burkina Faso, it's called Jil. And then the Jil is a little bit of a different construct from a Mande balafon and things like that. But when I say balafon, I basically mean a West African xylophone.
What kind of resonators does it have?
Usually gourds.
Gourds.
And these are gourds of different sizes. So, the gourds have to be selected to give the optimal resonance for the pitch. And then most of the time, there will be little holes in the gourds, and those holes will then be closed with originally spider webs. But nowadays it's become more difficult to find the spiders, so you use cigarette paper, and it gives it this very characteristic buzz.
Yeah, right. Sort of like a cajon.
Yeah. So, you'll find one really interesting thing is that with a lot of African instruments, you'll find, sort of say, additions to these instruments that are mirlitone, sympathetic vibration noisemakers. You find that on djembe. You can put like some metal rings on a djembe, and it stretches all through Africa, really. I mean, in Zimbabwe, bottle caps on mbira to go, to give that distortion to the sound. And again, it's one of those ways in which I think African music tends to be so well compatible with electronic music, is that in a lot of electronic music, people are looking for distortion and for processing, sound processing. And in a lot of, let's say, Western instrumental music, people are looking for a purity of sound. And so a lot of African traditional instruments have the effects pedal already built in.
That's totally fascinating. That's amazing. And it reveals my extreme ignorance about that music, that I didn't even know that, but that is so interesting. I have a few pieces that involve mild preparations to a vibraphone, where you put coins on the keys and things like that, which creates a wonderful creates a wonderful sort of distorted resonance. And but that's part of the conception of these instruments. That's extremely interesting.
It is, and it's done in different ways in different regions. I don't know how we. Oh yeah. So I was going to say that there were two balafon players among the musicians who came to this workshop. Ali Keita, who is a absolutely great virtuoso balafon player, who today lives in Berlin and is all over the world and doing really interesting things. And then Kaba Kouyaté, who is also a fantastic virtuoso vibraphone player who's now living in Paris. Sorry, vibraphone, what did I say? Balafone player who's living in Paris and playing more Monday traditional music and music based on that. So these two guys were there and they were never playing at the same time. So whenever one played, the other one sat out. And at some point I asked them, why are you always alternating? Why don't you play at the same time? And they told me, well, our instruments are tuned differently, so they're not compatible. And then I said to them, hey, why don't you try playing together and let's take those two different tunings and try to make something out of that that they're incompatible. Let's turn that incompatibility into a compatibility. Let's see what we can find. And they did. And to me, that was one of those moments that made this what I've now, in the meantime, come to call experimental intercultural collaboration work, which is kind of this approach that I've developed to, working with people from different cultural backgrounds with the aim of coming up with something new that could not have done without the contributions of those different backgrounds. I've been calling this experimental intercultural collaboration, and I was shocked to see that when I Googled this phrase, that there was only the very few things that I had published. And I couldn't believe that, because to me it was such an obvious and even trivial chain of three words. Then I wrote my dissertation on that because I saw that nobody else is doing this.
Has it become a bit of a minefield because of the specter of, what do they call it, cultural appropriation?
That's a really interesting question. And my one-word answer has to be no. I have never had anyone, be it any collaborator or any audience or any listeners, complain that any of my intercultural collaborations have been cases of cultural appropriation. And so one can think about why this is so, because I think there's a whole host of people who are, it's like a little bit like the people sitting in the jazz clubs and they're like the jazz police, waiting for people to make mistakes. I think all jazz musicians know what I mean when I talk about the jazz police. I think there's also the cultural appropriation police. There's a lot of people who spend their days wanting to discover cultural appropriation, racism, injustices of all kinds, and for some reason they have never been able to discover this in my work.
How frustrating.
Yeah, so I think the whole premise of cultural appropriation as a concept is a rather problematic one to begin with, because culture, there is no such thing as a pure culture. I think that's a pretty trivial thing to say. And I think that cultures have borrowed from each other since time immemorial. And I think that in many cases, when people do things that are deemed to be cultural appropriations, they have done this out of appreciation for this other culture. I also think that as humans, we share way, way, way more than what separates us. So actually, my entire personal history, being the son of Holocaust survivors, being the son of refugees from communist Hungary, having gone to international schools, K to 12, basically, with a very, very, very short exception, but that also in a very international environment, then working in, places. I've never been a very Eurocentric musician, so this African thing came into my, my my horizon at a very early time in my development as a musician. So I don't really go to Africa representing European or American or Western music. I represent myself as an individual with my own personal background. I think all of these things have conspired to bring me to a worldview where I completely reject the idea of identity politics. I think identity politics can only have negative effects, and I think the negative effects are visible if you look at history. Almost no matter what war, for example, I mean, the Nazis is just the most screaming example, but generally almost everything is due to a clash of identities that are a clash that is being manufactured completely unnecessarily through identity politics. So it is completely mysterious to me why some people think that giving identity additional emphasis is going to advance social cohesion. That is completely, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I think the way we advance social cohesion is to basically undo this concept of identity. And so my entire way of going through life and my entire way of working is about the individual. So when I meet a musician from, say, Africa that I'm working with, that is not a musician from Africa for me, but that is an individual. And this individual has certain experiences, has certain knowledge. And, there's this concept of indigenous knowledge that is often propagated. Well, I think that's a pretty problematic concept also, because we're all indigenous to something. There's no person in the world who isn't indigenous. I mean, I'm probably the least indigenous person you'll find because I was born stateless. And, in a place where my parents settled a few years before I was born. I actually never learned to speak Hungarian, which is my parents' native language. So, it's hard to be less indigenous than I am. But so if you want, I'm indigenous to being a rootless cosmopolitan, but I'm indigenous to that. I've always sort of been a citizen of the world in a certain sense. So I'm indigenous to that. I think we're all indigenous to something, and saying that these people from, let's say, not the West, not the industrialized West or whatever we want to call it, are indigenous and Westerners are not, that is creating an artificial boundary, an artificial rift. But it's creating an us and them. And even when this is done with the best of intentions, I think the outcome is bound to be negative. And I think that when we look at, for example, the relationship between, let's say, Africa and Europe, both in the colonial times, which I personally didn't experience because I'm too young for that, and the post-colonial times, I think that it is, seeing group identity and indigeneity as determining factors rather than individual thoughts and accomplishment. Of course, it's a lot more complicated to think in terms of individuals, because now you've got, millions of people to deal with that theoretically you have to see in a separate way. But I think we need to, if we think of individual rights and really take individual rights seriously, then group rights are no longer actually necessary in the sense that we know them, because the need for group rights comes about because people of a group are not given a certain right a priori. So if we give each individual in the group the right, then the group as a whole has the right. And I think as people, we are members of many overlapping group identities. And so I think that the concept of intersectionality, which has been used to make many arguments in support of identity politics, is actually a pretty simple notion that we have different attributes. And
does that even need to be explained? I mean, that's,
well,
we're not one-dimensional cardboard cutouts.
exactly.
Like if you look at old cartoons from the 50s, cartoon strips would be populated by characters that have a single attribute that defines them, right? So Richie Rich is rich. That's his only attribute. That's his only character trait, is that he's rich. Or you have another character whose attribute is that he's fat, or that he plays the piano, and that's it. You know, it's like you're one-dimensional, and that's great for a comic strip, right? But it's not very reflective of lived experience.
No, and I think identity politics tries to see people in that way. So then along comes a concept like intersectionality, which tries to temper that. And I think that the idea of intersectionality as such is absolutely reasonable. But of course, then again, intersectionality is the perfect argument in favor of the individual, because if you play that game long enough, every single individual will have a different intersectional profile. Yeah, so in that sense, intersectionality, if you play that game out, you end up with the individual. And I do try to encounter everyone as an individual and make a minimal amount of assumptions about a person that I don't know. Now, as humans, we all have our biases, and so these biases cause us to make certain assumptions, but I always try to limit those assumptions as much as possible.
Categories have their uses, right? Because the world is infinitely complex. And so we need, on some level, to overlay some kind of rough heuristics, right? So that we're not confronted with total novelty all the time.
Yes, and then you have things like implicit bias training so that we get rid of our implicit biases. But actually, having implicit biases to some degree is a feature of human intelligence, and not even human. Animals have it too. But then there is, so I don't think that there's anything wrong with having biases, but I think we need to know how much authority we give these biases over our way of seeing the world and treating individuals. And I think that to get back to my intercultural work, I think that nothing is being taken away from anybody by this work being done. In many cases, it's in collaboration between, it's really interesting, for example, in Beta Folie, in that group that started in the Ivory Coast and then ran through the rest of the 90s, you had musicians from very different cultural backgrounds within West Africa. And these musicians didn't necessarily share the same repertoire of, let's say, pieces or something. So when they played together, they had to find a modus operandi. And we, like from a European or American vantage point, we tend to see, for example, this incredibly diverse continent of Africa as like one homogeneous cultural landscape, which it absolutely is not.
Well, that's just lack of familiarity.
Right. But the degree of diversity is something that you really have to experience. And you experience it by, for example, observing these musicians struggling to play together. But in spite of their struggles, and in spite of maybe my struggles to then understand what they're doing, and we need to explain these things to each other. And, I don't think that it's fair to say that music is a universal language. I think music is it's an environment where we can universally try to appreciate each other. But I think that we ultimately see that in spite of our struggles, 98% of the human condition is shared. And I think the difference between cultures comes in the shape of individuals having some idea, and that idea somehow entering the cultural canon of that region, of that whether it's a linguistic, whatever the however geographic the region is defined, and then further explorations being done based on those initial ideas. So, for example, to get back to that music from the Kingdom of Buganda, it explores certain aspects of music cognition in a way that no Western music, to the best of my knowledge, does. But that doesn't mean that we have different ways of understanding music in Uganda or in, Kehl here on the German-French border. It is that this particular type of music gives rise to the exploitation of certain cognitive phenomena. And this is something that anybody can enjoy. You could maybe understand it in a different way, because what is very often the case in African music, not always, but very often, is that some sort of text, some sort of lyric, and therefore also some sort of story is baked into the music, even if it is not being said or sung, even if it's purely instrumental music. So, for example, you will find a different dimension of appreciation of this music if you speak Luganda and you actually know the histories that are being talked about. I mean, just speaking Luganda is not enough. You have to know, for example, the historical events. If you take a piece from the repertoire of the court music of Uganda, let's say, I don't know, Sematimba ne Chikwabanga, it's a story about two princes. You have to know that story, but then if you understand Luganda, maybe you can somehow link the music up to the embedded text, which as a non-speaker, you're not going to be able to do. But you still can enjoy the incredibly sophisticated use of how we hear two interlocking melodic streams that we cannot differentiate by timbre, we cannot differentiate by musician. We hear something very fast, and now we start reorganizing what we're hearing, for example, into frequency bands. And now you hear this polyphony of music in different frequency bands. You hear these meta melodies that emerge that are not played as such by any musician, that just emerge. Kubrick calls them inherent patterns. They just emerge through the combination, through the interlocking combination of these melodies. And that's an incredibly interesting way to organize listening. And so, for example, I thought, okay, how am I going to respond musically to this? And so that's kind of, long digression now. But you were asking, how did my interest in African music start? So that's how it started.
Well, if you look at it from the opposite perspective, there's plenty of people who enjoy Bach cantatas who don't speak a word of German and have only a superficial understanding of the biblical texts. And, there are plenty of other levels on which you can enjoy a piece like that. But there's something I really want to ask you about, which is, you're obviously an exceptionally open-minded person. You would have to be to live the life that you've had and to be interested in so many different cultures, and you're constantly traveling the world and so on.
I try.
But, okay, here's the question. So first of all, have you ever encountered a musical experience that was so utterly foreign in its constitution or whatever, in its musical thinking, that you couldn't find a way into it? It was just not available to you as an experience. And the reason I ask this is I very often meet people I exist in the Western world. My territory is Western Europe and North America, but I encounter a lot of people who will say, I'm an opera guy, and that's what they're interested in. And their experience of music is very narrow. Or there's lots of people who are only interested in 60s rock or whatever it is, or rhythm and blues or jazz or whatever. They'll identify very strongly with a very specific genre, and anything outside of that is hard for them to enjoy. I think that's partly a personality attribute, openness to new experience. There could be something else behind it too. I don't know. But with your exposure to all of these different African musical cultures, have you ever encountered anything where it was just such a fundamentally different conception that you couldn't find a way into it?
I would say yes. And I can give you two examples. So one of them was that pretty early in my days of working in Africa, I was part of a project where a delegation of Austrian composers was sent to Zimbabwe. And we went to a village in western Zimbabwe, not far from Lake Kariba, called Siachilaba, where we met the villagers who played a traditional music there. And, something that I found there that's really interesting is that there's this kind of cliche that in Africa, music is always communal. And this turns out not to be true in many African cultures. And for example, in this village, there was an elderly gentleman called Siankwede, who was the village composer. And he was tasked with composing pieces for the villagers to play. And it was his compositions. And they were attributed to him also. But they were in a tradition of the Batonga people called Ngoma Buntibe, which is a kind of a funeral music. And this music was very strange. So it was played by a large number of people who played horns that could only play one note each, and they were hocketing in very sophisticated ways. This is something that you find in a lot of Bantu cultures and also Bantu-adjacent non-Bantu cultures like the Bandalinda, for example. But so they were playing that, and then there were some drums. And I could not figure out how this music worked. And the villagers were dancing to it. So, unfortunately, I don't speak any Chitonga, and there was nobody there to translate. So, the English that the villagers spoke was rather poor. So, I couldn't communicate with them in any kind of detailed way about the music. It's very fascinating music. The South African musicologist Hugh Tracy went there and he said, this is ruckus noise, not worth analyzing. But it is worth analyzing. It's very interesting music, and it sounds a little bit like maybe something by Stockhaus or something like that. But I could not find my way in. I tried to imitate the drum part, and I was able to do that, but I couldn't figure out how it fit into the music. And to this day, I don't know. But the one thing that I learned there is that I saw the musicians dancing. And one thing that will work, across sub-Saharan Africa is that if you don't know where the beat in a music is, you need to look at the dancer's feet. And where the dancer's feet hit the ground is where the beat is. And so I saw where the dancer's feet hit the ground, but I could not synchronize this in any way with the music that I was hearing. So I think what I learned here is that basically any music is dance music. Even music by Boulez is dance music. And I'll say in a moment why. I don't know. I'm just trying to think about the non-danciest composer, maybe Xenakis or something. I don't know. But what you need to know is the code. You need to crack the code. You need to know what are you supposed to listen for that will give you the in into the music to understand how you're going to dance.
But it's physiological, right? I mean, let me give you an example of what I mean. So we know that traditional Hungarian music has unequal beats, right? There are long beats and short beats, and they're not exact multiples of each other, right?
And the Balkans even more.
Yeah, and the Balkans even more. So you can't notate that with traditional mensural notation unless you do a snap to grid, and then you make it so that they have to be equivalent to a dotted eighth or an eighth or a 16th, which completely deforms the actual. And the reason for that, of course, is it's connected to a physical gesture that you can't reproduce with that notation. It's sort of like the Viennese waltz, right, which is based on a specific dance pattern.
And swing in jazz.
Exactly. It's a feel that stems from a way of moving physically. It's embodied, in other words. And if you're outside of that culture, if you don't have that in your bones, in a sense, or if you're not familiar with that way of moving, then I would think it would be very hard to find a way into it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that this can be learned. I think that you can change. Again, I'm my view opposing any form of identity politics. I think that the idea that if you're born or raised in one cultural environment, you're stuck in that for life. I don't think that's true. I think we can redefine ourselves culturally. I mean, you have Westerners playing Indian music or African music of different kinds and things like that who do it as well. You have to get deeply into it. That has never been my own mission. My mission has been to understand concepts and to try to find creative responses and innovative approaches through a multitude of concepts. But I know people who have gotten deeply into, I played once a long time ago, and unfortunately he has died in the meantime. But I played a couple of recording sessions in New York with a sarod player called Steve James. This was a guy, he was American, and then he lived in like Budapest, but he must have been one of the most deeply competent sarod players in Indian music. He was a student of Ravi Shankar's and things like that. And, the depth of knowledge was incredible. He was not very well known. But I think it's possible to acculturate to a very, very deep degree. And I think, it's interesting, these special, for example, rhythmic features, I think they're completely obtainable. And if you look at what's happening in jazz, for example, with swing, there's this problem of this little note, ding, ding, ga, ding, the ga, that you can't really notate. So there's a lot of, I think, obscurantism being done around that kind of a thing. Jazz also, like a lot of other musics and traditions of any kind, there's also always this social phenomenon of, are you being let into the group of the initiated? And there's a possibility to keep people out by saying, oh, that guy doesn't swing. But it often doesn't really mean very much. So, one thing that makes this swing such a challenging rhythm to notate is that every individual musician's phrasing is slightly different. I think what a lot of people don't seem to see, or at least don't mention for some reason, is that what makes this swing note so difficult to grasp is that its rhythmic placement with respect to the continuing steady beat is a function of tempo. So, you have a very slow ballad, it'll be like a double, triple, quadruple dotted, 16th note, da, da, ba, da. And then, ding, ding, a 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 ding. At some point when you're in a fast tempo, it's an eighth note. And so the interesting thing about this is that it migrates, so to say, to the left as the tempo gets higher. And that is a phenomenon that I have not seen in any other kind of music. I don't think it's a phenomenon that exists in European music of any kind. I don't think it's a phenomenon that I've encountered in African music. There is a German musicologist called Rainer Pollack who's done a lot of research in Mali, particularly in Bamako, with urban professional djembe players. And he says that he has encountered this phenomenon there in their playing. Mm-hmm. I have not. Maybe he's right. I don't know.
Well, in American popular music, there's a kind of continuum that runs from straight eighths to maybe triplet rhythms, shuffle rhythms, and then swing, right? In terms of how close you are to the next beat. Well, something like that.
I don't think that there's a difference between shuffle rhythms and swing as far as that's concerned. I think that shuffles just don't work because it's a constant ding a ding a ding a ding a ding. It doesn't work at certain speeds. It has maybe a smaller tempo range that it works at. But you were talking about music at very fast and slow tempos before we started recording. And one thing that's, it seems to me, is that actually the tempo range that we have at our disposal as humans is actually not that wide. Because when the beat gets slower than a certain speed, we start subdividing. And when it gets faster than a certain speed, we start grouping. And I think that's also a very interesting difference in the rhythmic concept of, let's say European and African music. Again, the basic perception is the same, but the question is, how do we conceive of the organization of it? And in Western, like European music, coming from the tactus and everything, we have more the tendency of a slow beat that's subdivided and that can have different subdivisions. Whereas in Africa, we have more the concept of a fast pulse that can be grouped in different ways.
Well, that's exactly what Tondeleu says in this book, which you might know.
I don't.
Music of the 20th Century.
I don't know that book.
Really interesting book. This actually opened up my mind a lot about rhythm. This is a book, he actually wrote this in 64, I think. Huh. So it's a kind of a funny title, Music in the 20th Century, given that the 20th century wasn't over yet. It's a fascinating book. But he points out that there's the tradition of mensural rhythm, in which you start with a large beat unit and subdivide it, right? You start with a breve, and then you have a semi-breve, and so on. And then other musical traditions that start with a small beat and add them together.
Exactly.
And so he calls that additive versus subtractive rhythms. Right. And it's kind of obvious, but I hadn't thought about that until I read this book, which is amazingly insightful, by the way.
I've got to check it out. Thank you for mentioning it. I'm not sure if the word additive completely does the African rhythmic conception, whatever that is. It also varies in different cultures and in different musical genres. I mean, you have, for example, talking drum music that's used as like a phone between villages, which imitates the rhythm and the inflection of language. That doesn't have any underlying beat at all. So there's different genres and different purposes for the music. But I think that it's not so much a matter of adding pulses, but more a matter of grouping. And those groups then stay throughout one piece of music or throughout one musical genre. They stay the same. Of course, the most obvious contrast is between binary and ternary groupings.
And asymmetric groupings, which are rare, comparatively speaking.
In Africa, it's comparatively rare. For example, there is in the Mande repertoire, there is a piece called Boloba, which is in what we would consider 5/8. It goes like... So that's it, but that's very rare. But then one thing that makes the special interest in a lot of types of African music is that it's not about adding really, but it's about contrasting. So you have a pattern that is conceived in a binary, and you have a pattern that's conceived in ternary, and those patterns are now played at the same time. And when you dance to it, you can choose how do you conceive of this music?
That's interesting.
Or you have one pattern that can be heard. You have maybe the waraba. It's a traditional rhythm of the Mossi people in Burkina Faso. Very simple. Dung daga daga dung daga daga dung daga daga. So you can say dung daga daga dung daga daga dung daga daga dung. You can say dung daga daga dung daga daga dung daga daga dung.
Okay,
and you can dance in either way.
So that relates to something you said with respect to Notebook, which is that you can play patterns where you say to one player, this is going to be your downbeat, and this is going to be your downbeat, right. And they belong to the same pattern.
Right.
But
so one of the immediate responses that I had when I was like 21 or something like that, when I heard this lecture by Kubik, was that I said, okay, so I have the Amadinda xylophone that he was talking about, where two people are sharing, actually three people, but we don't need to talk about the third one now. The two people, the Omunazi and the Omwawuzi, are sharing the same xylophone, playing opposite each other and interlocking very similar melodies at a very fast tempo. So I can do the same thing with my arms around the drum set. And as a matter of fact, it's likely that this kind of music, before it was played on xylophones, was played on a harp called enanga, where the two players were actually being done by the two hands of the same player. So anyway, I decided that I'm going to do that on the drums. So I'm going to describe like different types of motion patterns, circular motion patterns around the drum set with my arms. And then I can still add my feet too. And I very quickly came up with very complex polymetric patterns that are actually, it's an illusion of polymetrics because I'm just playing hand-to-hand 16th notes or whatever you want to call it. But because the patterns are of different length and because, my drum set has different components that I can hit or not hit, I, for example, create the illusion of, let's say, 3 against 4. But that's just because of the the arrangement of the drum set. I'm actually playing in continuous circular motion, just equal notes. Now, of course, I can then make this more complex and start not playing equal notes and things like that. And that's something I've been working on. But I'm still, I started with this, like, it's soon going to be 40 years that I've started with this, and I'm still working on it. But so in Notebook, in one of the pieces, Kaleidoscope Point, one thing that I said is, okay, here we have, I'm going to play this polymetric pattern on the drums. And you musicians are going to each choose one component of the drum set that will be your downbeat. So let's say my cymbal is your downbeat. So every time I hit ting, I hit the cymbal, it's a downbeat for you. And because the patterns are regular, that comes at a regular time. But now the person who uses the next instrument that I hit, which is, let's say, a rack tom right here, is going to be off with their beat is going to be off by that one time increment. And they're going to be referring to a different downbeat. Then, of course, because we are in a semi-improvised environment, I don't have to keep to that, right? I can start messing them up by changing patterns on them, and they have to keep looking and listening to what I'm doing. So I'm conducting them in this way. And can, for example, say, well, let's say, I don't know, the violin is playing with my snare drum, let's say. I want to hear a violin solo. So all I have to do is play a snare roll, because if I'm not giving the others any downbeats, they're not going to play.
Right.
So I just play a snare roll, and then I hear a violin solo.
Amazing.
And what exactly the violinist plays, she makes up whatever she wants, but she does it as long as I keep playing the snare. And if I go away from the snare, well, then, because they're just playing their downbeats. I can also say, don't play just your downbeats, play something in addition to your downbeats. Then it gets harder for me to control.
Right. Oh, it's amazing.
So then this drum roll with the violin solo it's basically just a series of very, 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 very fast downbeats.
Okay. That's incredibly interesting. There's something I really have to ask you about, which I can't imagine, actually. Now, in the Western world, we're so accustomed to evaluating everything we hear. And so, for example, just yesterday in the car, I was listening to a program on Radio France where it's a thing they do where they'll play 7 or 8 different versions of the same piece, and they'll get a bunch of professional performers together, and they won't say who the performers were, but there'll be 8 different versions of a particular Beethoven quartet or something, and then they'll discuss amongst themselves about,
on the radio.
Yeah, on the radio, about which version they like.
Who listens to that? That's extremely boring.
Oh, I don't. I guess
it's interesting to me, but like to somebody who's not a professional musician.
Oh, it is. It can be quite interesting depending on who's on the program, because it changes every time. And then afterwards they reveal who the performers were. And from an external point of view, if you've never heard a Beethoven string quartet before, or yesterday it was the Art of Fugue. It was one of the later fugues in the collection, and they were sort of arguing about whether version B or version D was the superior version and giving their reasons and so on. From the outside, you just kind of hear a generic fugue, and you don't necessarily notice the differences between versions all that much. It's not, you don't have a close enough familiarity with the music for that to be particularly meaningful to you. Now, if you're coming to another musical culture, do you set aside that tendency to evaluate critically completely? So, for example, if you're listening to village music in Uganda, does it occur to you to think, well, this is a particularly mediocre version of this, or would you say, oh, this is a particularly outstanding village ensemble, or do you just set that aside? Like, is there a point where that kind of critical evaluation isn't appropriate? And if not, why wouldn't it be appropriate? Because we approach all other music that way.
I don't know. I teach at the Conservatoire Royal de Bruxelles, so there are a lot of music students around, and I don't know. I can go to a flute class and listen to different flute students playing a certain passage or something like that. Am I really knowledgeable enough on flute playing to judge who's doing the best job? Like if somebody does a blatantly horrible job, then I'll be able to notice that. But I think it depends not so much on the culture, but it depends. Do you have the, do you have the insight? Do you have the knowledge on that music to be able to evaluate it? And I think to me, at least, when I clearly don't, then I don't try. Now, that's a very that radio program that you were talking about. That's a very geeky radio program.
Oh yeah,
right there.
totally. Yeah.
So,
And to be fair, it just happened to come on.
but for example, when I'm working with musicians in Africa, they will be, they'll be playing something and then they'll get very upset because they felt that they did a bad job and they'll start again. It's exactly the same. Again, we're I was still, just to get back to the identity politics for a moment, not only do I feel that I need to encounter people as individuals, but I feel I cannot go around the world evaluating cultures. Every culture, and wherever you go, you have things that you can learn from. That doesn't mean that you have to adopt that culture wholesale, but I think that it's completely legitimate to be influenced by and to learn from aspects that you like and rule out aspects that you don't like. I mean, there's aspects. I grew up in Austria. I don't like coffee. Vienna has a big coffee house culture. I like the coffee houses. I like sitting there. Can't drink the damn coffee.
How about cake?
Oh, I like the cake, but
Kuchen.
but so I mean, it doesn't. We are all individuals, and we all have different expertise. And if somebody from Congo studies Mozart deeply, then they will be a much greater expert on Mozart than me, who has not studied Mozart deeply, because I have not studied Mozart deeply. Being Austrian, or the fact that I'm American doesn't make me more knowledgeable on Charles Ives or something than somebody from Congo who's studied Charles Ives. So I really don't think that that's a cultural matter, and I think it's a mistake to make culture so responsible for everything. Every individual is part of some kind of cultural fabric, and we are all combining elements from different cultures. In recent times, there's so much political discourse about multiculturalism, and that multiculturalism supposedly has failed and things like that. I think that's really a very pessimistic and unnecessarily pessimistic view. I think, I'm interested in intercultural work, which I would distinguish from multicultural work, because I think multiculturalism is more the idea that different cultures live alongside each other with very limited interaction. It's something that you have in a city where you have, one street with Korean restaurants and the next street with Senegalese restaurants. And so you have these two cultures living next to each other. But I think that in most multicultural environments, even when there is not a whole lot of pressure for people to adapt, I think people live together very peacefully.
Oh, well, look, I'm from Toronto, which is arguably the most multicultural city in the world.
Right.
And in the 1990s in particular, it was an amazingly well-functioning city. I mean, you had people from 160 different countries living together, and it worked incredibly well. Of course, there were some social tensions. You would have them in any big city of a multi-million number of inhabitants. But on the whole, it was an incredibly culturally and ethnically diverse city. And it never even crossed my mind when I was growing up to consider that this was in any way a problem or that it was causing tensions or anything like that. You just didn't even think about it.
Exactly. And I think that was and still is because a vast majority of these people, even though they came from different cultural backgrounds and sometimes didn't speak the same language and so on and so forth, but still subscribed to certain abstract, a certain very limited and easily surveyable set of abstract values.
Yes.
That they all, a very simple and largely abstract social contract that they subscribe to. And I think a lot of the problems we're having now is that for a variety of reasons, certain people have arrived, sometimes arrived without this intention, but have then decided not to subscribe to that social contract. And that has very little to do with the language they speak or with a lot of elements of their culture. It can, under certain circumstances, have to do with an ideology they follow, which puts them at odds. But even followers of this ideology, for example, we can mention Islam, most of them will practice a very, whatever you want to call it, non-radical form, which some people would argue then is an incomplete form. Okay, that argument can be made, but the relevance of that argument is debatable, I think, because in practice, I don't care really how a certain person thinks about religion as long as they don't try to impose that religion on me. So I think we all, again, have our individual, once I was speaking to somebody who said something like, we were talking about a ritual in a village in Africa somewhere, the way these people think about this, I was like, wait a minute, you're talking about some villagers in a remote village in Central Africa or something like that. You don't know what these villagers are thinking. And probably every single villager is thinking something different in the same ritual because they are thinking about this ritual in a different way. For one person, let's say the mystical aspect is very important. For another person, that's not so important. For they're having fun dancing and things like that. So different people are thinking about this in different ways, depending on their individual minds, their experiences. Now, in a remote village, their experiences might be a lot more similar than we have in a city like Toronto. But still, everybody has their own mind, and we can't leave our own minds. So sometimes it's very difficult for us to understand how somebody else is thinking. Some of the experiments I've been doing more recently with electronic music, I'm trying to get people to think differently about playing together in a, for example, networked ensemble. And I'm trying to do this not to get into the individual minds, but to see if we can come up with new kinds of musical structures through the mediation of a computer. And I think that still, we're all thinking in different ways, but maybe it's interesting to see if we can try to structure our thoughts in certain ways, in different ways. And I'm just kind of detecting that I'm contradicting myself in a certain way here. So that's why
it's hard not to do that over the course of a 2.5-hour conversation. At some point, you're gonna put your foot in it.
But I can, if you want, we can talk about improvisation through cross-adaptive data processing.
Well, funny you should mention that. Yeah. Do you think that you mentioned that you were born stateless. Do you think that this was a necessary precondition for your capacity to go out in the world and be interested in so many things and not have this sort of, maybe not have a very strong identity imposed upon you from birth?
I think it's part of a, cultural fabric, a background of migration, of displacement that I was born into, and a bureaucratic result of which was that I was born without a citizenship.
Like one thing I'm really interested in is it's hard to think of someone more Viennese than Schoenberg. But when he emigrated to the U.S. and had kids, he very consciously raised them as Americans. And he didn't want them to feel connected to Austria particularly. I interviewed 2 of his children, and they both said the same thing. It was, no, you're American kids. And was that a factor at all in your childhood?
Yes. In fact, it's the major reason why I never learned Hungarian, which is something that I very much regret, and I would love to do it. And, because, I've not lived in Austria now for more than 30 years, and, I've become American, and now I'm living in Belgium. But because I have a base in Vienna, my relatively somewhat frequent trips to Hungary tend to be a very short duration, because if I, for example, have a concert in Budapest, well, I can drive back to Vienna. It's just a 2.5-hour drive. So it has made the amount of time I have spent in Hungary very limited. And just recently, I spent 5 days in Budapest, which is probably the longest I've ever spent there. And I have Hungarian in the back of my head. And I noticed within those 5 days an absolutely unbelievable improvement of my Hungarian. My actually non-existent Hungarian, but I was now starting to be able to activate, because I was in an immersion environment. I was starting to be able to activate some of this Hungarian that I actually know but normally can't reach. in my mind. And
Because you must have heard it growing up, right?
I heard an awful lot of it, and my pronunciation is perfect. I have a somewhat not terribly small vocabulary.
And your
actually,
parents presumably spoke Hungarian amongst themselves.
to each other, but then they spoke German to me. And why did they do it? Because they were so happy to be out of Hungary that they, it's a little hard to believe this today, but back in the day, it was, Hungary to them was danger and persecution. And they didn't want me to be a Hungarian child. They wanted me to be an Austrian child because now, we're in the West and I should grow up speaking German. So that was one of the main reasons why I never learned Hungarian. So that definitely played an absolute role. And it's such a different situation from a lot of the migrants today. I mean, this will still exist, because somebody will come out of, I don't know, North Korea or something like that. But oftentimes the stories of migration today, well, in some cases, they're very harsh. Somebody coming out of Iran or, under certain circumstances, I don't know, Myanmar or something like that. Yes, it can be very, very harsh. But I think also, I mean, maybe there's an element of both of, on my mother's and my father's side, our families having been what is called assimilated Jewish families. So I really didn't grow up with any kind of Jewish culture or religion. Basically, I'm a Jew who was only reminded about that by Hitler. And but I grew up without any religion. And I grew up as an atheist, the son of atheists. I never felt any need to change that. I've remained an atheist till today. I've never seen any proof, any convincing reason to believe that God exists. So now I respect when somebody has the need to believe that. I respect that. I have no problem with that. But I personally don't really feel that connection.
Well, that's an intensely personal thing, obviously. Yeah. And I have a suspicion that there's a kind of religious impulse that we all have in different forms, and it can take on a musical form, actually. And it might be related to the same impulse, but it manifests in a different way. It's the idea of transcendence, right? The idea of connecting with something that goes beyond your individual experience, and that.
And see, again, for this, improvisation is a really great thing. And I think that improvisation can be a spiritual experience in the sense that you're feeling an amazing connection if you're in a group with other people, really listening closely to each other and trying to find a way together. It doesn't happen in all improvised settings. There's a lot of them where it doesn't happen at all. But I think it sometimes happens, and I'm sure that the same thing is true in chamber music too. I don't, unfortunately, I don't play chamber music, but I'm sure that in a string quartet or something like that, you have that same. I mean, I see it when people play music that I write. Some of this music is very, even though like you mentioned previously, in some cases in my music, the individual parts are not that difficult, but putting them together is very challenging. And so then the musicians need an exceptional amount of contact. And what is this contact between musicians in an ensemble? I'm really interested in this. I don't think it's something I can really describe, and it's not something that I can. So I think one can teach improvisation in certain ways by teaching approaches to improvising, methods, vocabularies on the instrument, by trying to get people to not be intimidated, by trying to get people to try to retrieve their creativity in the moment when it counts. I think these are things that can be taught. I think that originality, to some extent, can be taught, because I think it's in large part about using resources that are not overused as influences and then asking certain very foundational questions about them. But I think what is very difficult to verbalize and very difficult to teach, I think, is this intimate, unique connection that you feel playing together in an ensemble. And I don't know, maybe that's something that one can only find through the experience. I'm not sure.
Yeah, probably. I think it's something that you can't really understand if you're exterior to that process.
I mean, people talk a lot about listening, but I think it's the combination of listening and acting, and not letting either one of those things fall short, and not giving up your own personal agency again as an actor, your personal vocabulary and things like that. Not giving that up, maintaining your personality while being really somehow intensely paying attention to what another person is doing.
Well, in my own case, one of the things that I rebelled against early was there's a certain, what would you say? There's a certain pressure in the new music world to be promiscuous in the sense of doing a project here, a project there. You come in, you work with an ensemble for a couple of days, and then you go somewhere else. And to sort of, do one commission after another with all these different ensembles. And I think it's possible to get excellent results that way. But in my case, I always felt unsatisfied. And I wanted there to be more of a sense of a relationship with the performers, because I think you can hear that in the music if they have a sense of identification with what they're playing, as opposed to showing up, you do the gig, and you try to do a relatively accurate rendition of the score, but it doesn't go beyond that. Yeah. And so I've tried to structure my entire career around this principle, which has meant forming very strong bonds with a smaller number of players and writing for them extensively. And that's worked out extremely well because they just understand the work, right? There's a certain unspoken bond between us. And even if we don't work together for 5 years at a stretch, if we come back together and do another project, it's still there. Yeah. And that's amazing. And so, I've forfeited maybe a certain number of opportunities in order to focus more on that way of working. But I just think the results are so much better.
I completely agree. And it's fantastic when one can work with the same group of musicians over a sustained amount of time. I've been able to do that as a player with some groups. I mean, I have like 2, active groups at the moment, Burkina Electric and Hypercolor. These are 2 very, very musically different groups, but who, have not gone through any changes in personnel. Well, Burkina Electric did, but not in many, many years. And that's fantastic. And as a composer, it's also something I really enjoy. But I mean, when I first moved to New York, for example, I wanted to play with a lot of different people, a lot of different improvisers. And I played with a lot of people. And I saw that there are some cases of people whose language I'm very interested in as a listener, but with whom I don't feel a huge rapport improvising together with. I've experienced the exact opposite. People who I didn't think were that interesting that then were like extremely gratifying to play with, and we went somewhere unanticipated. But mostly, I think that also getting along personally with people is very important, and I feel that a lot of people, especially people who've been in the business, if you want to call it that, for a long time, sometimes are very difficult and hard to motivate. And I've stopped trying to play with those people because I just don't want to deal with it, quite frankly. I want to deal with people who are enthusiastic about playing, who will take on maybe a little bit of the organizational lifting as well. It's very difficult to find. But and then as a composer, I've been lucky enough now to write a couple of pieces for a group from Liège called Ensemble Hopper, and it's been really, really nice to work with them. And these kinds of, connections that I've had sometimes in my life, but too few times, frankly, so far. So I hope there'll be more of it in the future. I completely agree that that's a lot more interesting than doing commissions from 1,000 different groups. Yeah, but I think the important thing is hearing your music played and collaborating with musicians who can help you, because there's a lot of things that I, as a composer, don't know about certain instruments or certain types of music, and I need musicians to interact with.
We have to wrap up in a minute, unfortunately, but there's something that we've hardly touched on, which is your New York period. I mean, you lived in New York for almost 20 years, and you worked with, I think, what it would be fair to characterize as a lot of musicians associated with the downtown scene, and John Zorn, for example. And you've also worked with people like Henry Kaiser. I mean, how do you... these are people who have extremely idiosyncratic and deeply original practices that they've developed. How do you approach working with someone like that? Who can you just because I mean, you also have your highly individual practice and they have their highly. How do you come together and work together?
I just bring myself in. You know, Henry Kaiser was one of the first people I met in America, and we just kept in touch. And when I moved to the Bay Area, that was my first stop in my 30 years of living in the U.S. I contacted him and said, "Hey, I'm here now, and it's great. Come play with me. I'm playing tonight at a planetarium in Oakland. Come play with me." So we played, with a projection of galaxies and things like that, and it was cool. And then we just went on playing because there was something in each other's playing that we detected that we liked, that we thought was interesting. And I think that he's an extremely interesting player. Overall, a very underrated, I think, player who developed a vocabulary completely away from normal playing techniques.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he can play the guitar, but he doesn't play it in a conventional way, and yet he plays it in a very, non-extended technique way, in a very kind of, guitars get in a certain way that's idiomatic, but not in the traditional sense. It's very interesting. Of course, with the help sometimes of a lot of electronic effects processing and things like that. I mean, I think into all improvised collaborations, I kind of brought my own vocabulary and my own thinking, and that meshed well with certain people and less well with others. I think that's completely normal. And there were also, during the time I lived in New York, there were different fashions. For example, in the early 2000s, there was this fashion of lowercase improv, so to say. So a very abstract kind of noise, based, but sometimes very soft kind of improvisation that in many ways emulated, as did also, for example, British free improvised music of the 1960s, in many ways emulated new music composition.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to gravitate away from that kind of thing because I already compose, and I don't really want to accomplish the same things as a composer as I do, as an improviser as I do when I compose. I'm looking for surprise. I'm looking for social interaction, also provocation, and ways of socially organizing, of group dynamics. I'm looking for finding interesting, unexpected relationships between instruments and timbres and rhythms. I'm looking for people struggling to understand what the other person is doing. And so some very strange superimpositions can happen. For example, in compositions, I look, and I can't by any way say that I accomplished this, but I am looking to some extent for things that have to be the way they are. I feel that, I don't want to just have a section and then another section and ask myself, why does this section succeed this previous section? Couldn't I just, change the order? There has to be some kind of inner logical consequence, even if it's just evident to myself. And this is not something that I really look for in improvisation at all, but I do look for structure. And I do a lot of things in improvising, like, for example, bringing back previous motifs or something like that, or imitating and things like that. And by the way, a lot of free improvisers frown on imitation. They don't like imitation at all. Now, why this is, I'm not sure. But there are certain aesthetic, preferences and practices that have established themselves. So I sometimes deliberately adapt and sometimes deliberately go against that. And so these kinds of questions are questions that I'm asking myself when I improvise. But and they're very different questions, because when you compose, you have the luxury of having a lot of time to make decisions. And in improvisation, it's instantaneous. And I think that gets you to think differently about certain problems and structures. And I think that is fundamentally maybe a different issue from the written or not written question. So one thing that I'm trying to train myself to do as a player, but also simply as a musician, is to have an idea and then go directly to the instrument with this idea without the crutch of the intermediate step of notation.
Ah, that's interesting.
And, it's something that I consider, it's a type of musicianship that is not learned normally in conservatory training. I think it's an important aspect of musicianship.
So in the course of our conversation, we've talked a lot about your practice as an improviser and about the new CD Notebook, which, when is it out, by the way? Is it
March 27th?
March, okay, so it'll be out way before this goes public. Are there any other projects of yours that you'd particularly like to point listeners towards if they're not familiar with your work already?
Well, I mean, I'm constantly writing new pieces. At the moment, I'm writing a piece for a Belgian ensemble called Musique Nouvelle that'll be premiered in May. And there's always, new projects coming up afterwards. I have a huge backlog of recordings that I'd like to find ways to release, and also would really like to record some of my chamber music and chamber orchestra music, some of which is written and some of which is not yet written. But then I also have some research projects that I'm working on. So one of them is this, I briefly mentioned it, improvisation through cross-adaptive data processing, in which I'm trying to get improvisers to think about interplay and about musical structure along different lines. So for example, in terms of logical operators, if musician A does X and musician B does Y, then Z will happen to musician C, kind of like that. And trying to see to what degree we can anticipate each other's actions. Then another thing that I'm, trying to find a way to get into is an exploration of the possibilities of three-dimensional notation. What if we have, in addition to, usually in conventional notation, we have time on the x-axis and pitch on the y-axis. What if we have a z-axis? And we can do that through simulation on the computer screen, but we could also invent, for example, notational sculptural objects with, using 3D printing, and then translate movement patterns. I'm very interested in movement. And, I want to become more uncompromising about the things I actually really want to explore. So, for example, movement. We normally, when we play an instrument, we execute a physical motion of which we have a sonic result in mind, and we execute the motion of which we believe that it will lead to the sonic outcome. But what if we approach playing music from a purely choreographical angle, and then negotiate the oral result later on? I think that's extremely interesting. And for example, in the case of the three-dimensional notation, now we have these sculptural objects, and we can study certain movements by, for example, moving our hand along the edges of these objects. And now we can then translate that to instruments, which doesn't work with a lot of traditional instruments, but electronic instruments one can build that can do that kind of a thing. And what kind of understanding of music playing will that lead us to? So those are kinds of things that I'm really wanting to do. Then, but I mean, musically, I have tons of new ideas. The question is, when do I find the time to do it all? I want to start working with electronic drums, because I think that there's a lot of creative things that could be done with electronic drums that are not being done. And that goes as far as, for example, seeing if I can teach artificial intelligence to emulate some of my vocabulary as an improviser and seeing what happens then. But there's on the way there's a lot of other things like, gradual changes in sound throughout a piece and things like that. But right now, this next piece I'm going to be writing is another one of a series of pieces for chamber orchestra where I'm working on the concept of painting over something. So, a lot of these references come from visual arts, which is something that we haven't talked about, but visual arts is very important for me as an influence. And, work by people like Arnulf Reine or William Kentridge, or in this case now, a Vietnamese artist called Dinh Le, who died about a year ago. These are people who work with painting over another painting or erasing a painting and making a new one.
Yeah.
Or in the case of Dinh Le, weaving, for example, making photos and then cutting them up and weaving them together. So I'm working on the series of chamber orchestra compositions that are a little bit, about this idea of one music being the canvas for another music. And, that also then leads into an interest in sound installations and things like that. I think one of the troubles that people have with me is that I do so many different things. So I'm difficult it's difficult to say what I do exactly, but I just pursue these different interests because for me, there's just a lifelong interest in music and expression and just new possibilities. I think that, some people say that all music has already been done and we can now just recombine. And I think that 99% of musical possibilities have not been found yet. And
I think those people lack imagination.
Yeah, exactly. If we don't, I think 99% has not been done. And if we don't find some of this 99%, we only have our own lack of imagination to blame. So I'm trying to find an infinitesimally small part of these 99% that are missing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been an absolute delight. I suggest now we go get something for dinner, and we're going to continue the conversation off camera. And
can you already eat dinner now? We just had lunch 2 minutes ago.
2 minutes ago. I think I can manage it. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, head over to Patreon, where I park my ideas. You can find essays, articles, archival materials, pieces in progress, and it's also where I interact daily with people who are subscribing. So check out Samuel.Andreyev Patreon to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you.
Good.